The day the lawyer read my grandfather's will, the whole courtroom laughed. Not quiet laughter, not the polite hand-over-mouth kind that comes from people with manners. This was the full, ugly, head-thrown-back sound that comes from people who have been waiting to see someone fall and have finally gotten their wish. 23 people in that cramped mountain courthouse, and every one of them was looking at me like I was the punchline to a joke they'd been telling for 40 years. Judge Alonzo Hayworth stood at the podium, a lean man with a steel-gray mustache and eyes that had been handing down verdicts so long they'd forgotten how to show mercy. He held the will in his thin fingers like it was something unclean. When he read the final line, the part about what I was inheriting, he paused, looked up at me standing alone by the back wall, and said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, boy, I suppose even the dead can play cruel jokes on the living." The laughter came again. Someone in the second row slapped his knee. I was 16 years old. My mother had died in a mining accident when I was 7, a cave-in at the Silverton Works that took her and 14 men. My father abandoned us 2 years before that, walked out one morning for tobacco, and never came back. After my mother died, I became property of the state of Colorado. 3 months with my Uncle Vernon in Denver, who drank himself unconscious most nights and forgot to buy food. 4 months with the Crawfords, who needed a boy to haul water but didn't need a boy who asked questions. 6 weeks with a widow named Mrs. Phelps, who told me I had the devil's curiosity and sent me back with a note pinned to my coat. And most recently, 2 years at the Ridge Creek Home for Wayward Boys, where I learned to keep my head down, my mouth shut, and my stolen books hidden under the floorboards. I had 2 silver coins in my pocket. I had a wool blanket with holes in it. I had no family, no friends, and no place in the world that wanted me. And now, according to the will of a grandfather I had never met, I had the bare tooth claim. The judge read the details with undisguised contempt. 30 acres of granite mountainside at 11,000 feet. A sealed cave under a rock overhang, a collapsed cabin, no water, no timber worth cutting, no soil worth planting. The whole valley called it Old Man Caldwell's Folly, a pile of worthless rock that my grandfather had bought 40 years ago for $5 and a bottle of whiskey. The old fool spent his last years up there talking to himself, someone behind me muttered. Sealing caves, building God knows what. Everyone knew he'd lost his mind. $5 and a bottle of whiskey. That's what my inheritance was worth. That's what my grandfather's life work had been reduced to. That's what the whole courtroom was laughing at, a crazy old man's joke passed down to an orphan boy with nothing. But standing there in that cold courthouse, with 23 people laughing and Judge Hayworth's words still ringing in my ears, something happened that I didn't expect. Something lit up inside me. Not a match, a furnace. I looked at that piece of paper in the judge's hands, at the words sealed cave and rock overhang and 30 acres, and I felt something I hadn't felt since my mother died. I felt like something was beginning. If you want to find out what I did with that sealed cave high in the Colorado Rockies, how a 16-year-old orphan with 2 silver coins and a stolen blanket turned a hole in the mountain into something that saved an entire valley, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what I built inside that darkness, what I discovered in my grandfather's forgotten notebooks, is a story that still lives in those mountains today. I left 2 days later. Judge Hayworth didn't try to stop me. Nobody did. I carried everything I owned in a flour sack tied with twine, 2 coins of silver, a wool blanket with holes in it, and a canteen I'd stolen from the orphanage kitchen. The road to the Beartooth claim started out as a road. By the 3rd mile, it was a trail. By the 6th mile, it was a suggestion scratched into the mountainside by goats and desperate men. The air thinned as I climbed, and my lungs burned with each step. I stopped counting switchbacks after 40. The pines grew shorter and more twisted the higher I went. Their branches reached sideways like old men trying to keep their balance in a strong wind. I passed a wooden sign nailed to a dead spruce. Beartooth Mine, keep out. Someone had shot 3 holes through the word keep. The wood was gray and splitting. I wondered how long ago my grandfather had put it there. I remembered what a man at the general store had said when I'd asked for directions. He'd looked at me with something between pity and amusement. "You planning to farm rock, boy?" he'd asked. The other men at the counter had laughed. I'd said nothing and walked out. The trail narrowed to nothing at the edge of a scree field. Loose shale shifted under my boots. I slipped twice, caught myself on my hands, and tore the skin from both palms. The blood mixed with granite dust and dried into a gray paste. I kept climbing. When I finally saw the Beartooth claim, I understood why they'd laughed. The property sat at maybe 11,000 feet, tucked beneath a massive granite overhang that jutted from the mountainside like the prow of a stone ship. The overhang was perhaps 80 feet wide and extended out 40 feet from the cliff face. Beneath it, there was nothing. Just bare rock, loose scree, and a few scraggly bushes that looked like they were dying of embarrassment for trying to grow there. No trees worth cutting, no soil worth planting, no water visible anywhere. Just a gaping ledge of rock in the sky. Two structures stood on the property, if you could call them standing. The first was a cabin, 2 stories of logs that had shifted so badly the whole building leaned 10 degrees to the east. Half the roof had collapsed inward. The windows were empty frames stuffed with rags and old newspapers. A family of skunks had made their home beneath the sagging porch, and they watched me approach with more ownership than I felt. The second structure was stranger. Against the back wall of the overhang, someone had built a wall of concrete blocks, maybe 12 feet wide and 8 feet tall, sealing off what looked like a natural opening in the rock. A cave entrance blocked. The concrete was cracked and stained with lichen, but it held. A rusted iron door had been set into the center of the wall. The door was padlocked. I stood there for a long time looking at the sealed cave and the ruined cabin and the acres of bare stone. The wind cut through my thin jacket. A hawk circled overhead, probably wondering if I'd die soon enough to be worth eating. $5 and a bottle of whiskey. That's what my grandfather had paid for this place, according to Judge Hayworth. Standing there in the thin mountain air, blood drying on my palms, I thought maybe the previous owner had gotten the better end of that deal. But I had nowhere else to go. The cabin door hung crooked on one hinge. I had to lift it and drag it sideways to get inside. The smell hit me first, mildew and mouse droppings and something else, something older, like decades of loneliness compressed into the wood itself. The main room was small, maybe 15 feet by 12. A cast iron stove sat in the corner, its chimney pipe rusted through in 2 places. A wooden table with 3 legs and a stack of rocks where the 4th should be. A chair that had lost its back. The floor was dirt, packed hard by years of boots, now covered in a layer of debris, dead leaves, mouse nests, a bird skeleton picked clean. I found the trunk in the back corner, half buried under a collapsed shelf. It was made of oak, banded with iron, and chained to the cabin's main support post. The chain was rusted, but the padlock, the same make as the one on the cave door, was intact. I didn't have a key. I searched the cabin for 2 hours, pulling apart the remaining furniture, digging through piles of rotted cloth and rusted tools. Nothing. The light was failing when I finally gave up and sat down on the dirt floor, my back against the trunk. I was 16 years old. I had 2 silver coins, a torn blanket, and a sealed trunk I couldn't open in a cabin that was trying to fall down around me. The nearest town was 7 miles down a trail I could barely walk in daylight. Winter was 3 months away. I had no food, no tools, and no one in the world who would notice if I died. The wind found every crack in the cabin walls. I pulled my blanket around my shoulders and tried not to think about the morning. I woke before dawn, shivering so hard my teeth hurt. Frost had formed on the inside of the cabin walls. My breath hung in the air like smoke. I couldn't feel my feet. The padlock on the trunk was old, rusted. When I examined it in the gray morning light, I noticed the hasp it attached to was rusted too, not the lock itself, but the metal plate screwed into the trunk's lid. I found a flat piece of iron in the debris on the floor, wedged it under the hasp, and pried. The screws tore free from the rotted wood on the 3rd try. Inside the trunk, I found 5 leather-bound notebooks, a rolled canvas tied with string, a compass with a cracked glass face, a steel measuring rod stamped U.S. Survey, and a tarnished brass key. I picked up the first notebook. The leather was cracked but intact. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and precise. The ink faded to brown. March 12th, 1876. They called it worthless. I think it's only worthless if you never look beneath. I read the line 3 times. Then I read it again. My grandfather's handwriting, my grandfather's words. Written 40 years before I was born, in this same cabin, beneath this same stone overhang, looking at this same sealed cave. I turned the page. The overhang is the key. 83 feet wide at the widest point, 41 feet of projection from the cliff face. The stone ceiling rises to approximately 20 feet at the center. The rock is solid granite, no cracks, no seepage. A natural roof that will outlast any structure man could build. Below the overhang, the temperature remains remarkably stable. I have measured it at various times of day and night, in sun and shade, in August heat and October cold. It holds between 48 and 56 degrees. The stone acts as thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it at night. But the cave is the true discovery. I flipped forward, scanning pages filled with diagrams, measurements, calculations. My grandfather had been an engineer of some kind, or at least an educated man who thought like one. The notebooks were dense with technical observations. The cave extends approximately 120 feet into the mountainside. Natural limestone formation, remarkably dry. Interior temperature holds steady at 52 degrees year-round. The rock walls are approximately 3 feet thick on average, backed by the thermal mass of the mountain itself. The Romans understood this. The old European ice houses understood this. A space insulated by stone and earth maintains a stable temperature regardless of surface conditions. But they used these principles for storage, for cooling. I intend to use them for warmth. I sat on the cabin floor as the light strengthened, reading my grandfather's plans. He had intended to build a living structure inside the cave, not a simple shelter, but an insulated dwelling that would trap heat so efficiently that a small fire could warm it through the coldest mountain winter. His design was ingenious. Corrugated metal sheets, cheap, lightweight, curved naturally into an arch, would form an inner shell beneath the cave's stone ceiling. The gap between the metal roof and the rock above would be packed with insulation, dried pine needles, dead moss, whatever dry organic material could be gathered from the forest. The granite overhang would protect the entire structure from snow loads and weather. The cave's natural thermal stability would provide a baseline temperature. The insulated metal shell would trap body heat and stove heat inside. The calculation is simple, he had written. The cave holds at 52 degrees naturally. The human body produces heat constantly. A small stove produces more. If that heat cannot escape, if it is trapped by an insulated shell and reflected back by a metal surface, the interior temperature will rise and stabilize at a level far above the baseline. I believe a man could survive the harshest winter in this cave with barely any fire at all. I closed the notebook. My hands were shaking, and not from the cold. Someone had believed in this place. Someone had looked at these 30 acres of worthless rock and seen something no one else could see. Someone like me. I cried, not from sadness, from the overwhelming recognition that I was not alone, that someone had come before me and seen what I was starting to see, that the laughter in Judge Hayworth's courtroom was not the final word. I picked up the brass key. The key fit the padlock on the cave door. The iron door groaned when I pulled it open. The hinges were rusted but functional. My grandfather had built things to last. A smell washed out, cool and mineral, like wet stone in ancient darkness. I stepped inside. The cave entrance was narrow, maybe 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall. But after 15 feet, it opened up. My eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness, and what I saw made me catch my breath. The main chamber was roughly 60 feet wide and extended back at least 100 feet into the mountain. The ceiling rose to perhaps 20 feet at its peak. The floor was natural limestone, smoothed by centuries of water, remarkably level, and along the walls, stacked neatly, covered with canvas tarps, materials. Hundreds of pounds of materials. I pulled back the nearest tarp. Corrugated iron sheets, 40 of them at least, each about 3 feet wide and 8 feet long. They were rusted at the edges, but mostly sound. The next stack held more of the same. The next held wooden beams, rough-cut pine, dry and solid. My grandfather had been gathering supplies, planning, preparing, and then what? What had stopped him? I found the answer in Notebook 3. September 4th, 1878. The doctor in town confirms it. The cough is consumption. He gives me perhaps a year, perhaps less. I will not finish the work, but I will leave everything ready for whoever comes after. The materials are gathered. The plans are complete. The cave awaits. They will laugh at whoever inherits this place. They laughed at me, but the stone does not care about laughter. The physics does not change because small men do not understand it. The work waits to be finished. If you are reading this, whoever you are, know that I believed. Know that I was not wrong. The numbers do not lie. Finish what I started. I sat in that cave surrounded by my grandfather's careful preparations, and I made a decision. I would stay. I would build what he had designed. I would prove that the old man who paid $5 for worthless rock was the only one who had seen the truth. But first, I had to survive long enough to try. I spent the next 2 days inventorying what I had. The cabin was barely habitable, but the stove could be repaired. The rust holes in the chimney pipe could be patched with flattened tin cans I found in the debris. I had no food except what I could find in the forest, a handful of wild onions growing near a trickle of snowmelt, some pine nuts, a few late-season berries that were more pit than fruit. The third day, I hiked back down to the town of Ridge Creek to spend my 2 silver coins. I bought 5 pounds of cornmeal, a pound of salt pork, a small axe with a cracked handle, and a box of matches. It was everything I could afford. The shopkeeper, the same man who'd asked if I was planning to farm rock, took my money without comment. But I saw him shake his head as I walked out. On the trail back up, I met my first skeptic. Her name was Mrs. Gosler. She was 60 years old, gray-haired, hard-faced, and she ran the only boarding house in Ridge Creek. She was also, I would learn, the most influential gossip in the valley. She had hiked 3 miles up the trail specifically to see if the rumors were true, that a boy had actually moved on to Old Man Caldwell's worthless claim. She stopped in the middle of the trail and looked at me the way you might look at a dog that had learned to walk on its hind legs, curious but certain it would fall down soon. "So you're the one," she said. "Alan Caldwell's grandson." I nodded. "You know they found him dead in that cabin, don't you? Coughed out his lungs over 3 winters up there." She crossed her arms. "Crazy old fool talking about living inside a mountain, building things no one understood. The whole town thought he'd lost his mind at the end." "He wasn't crazy," I said. My voice came out harder than I intended. "He was an engineer." Mrs. Gosler laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Engineer? Is that what you call a man who pays good whiskey for a pile of rocks? Is that what you call a man who seals himself inside a cave to die?" "He didn't seal himself in. He was preparing. He was preparing for nothing." She stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the lavender water she used to mask the scent of lye soap. "That claim is cursed, boy. Worthless land and a crazy man's dreams. You'd be better off going back to wherever you came from." "I don't have anywhere to go back to." Something flickered in her eyes, pity, maybe, or something harder. "Then I suppose we'll bury you up there too, just like we buried him." She walked past me down the trail. I stood there until I couldn't hear her footsteps anymore. Then I kept climbing. The first winter nearly killed me. I don't say that for dramatic effect. I mean it literally. 3 times that winter I came close enough to death that I could feel it waiting, patient and cold, just outside the cabin door. The first time was in late October. I had repaired the stove and patched the worst holes in the cabin roof, but I had underestimated how fast my food would run out. The cornmeal lasted 3 weeks. The salt pork lasted 4. By the end of November, I was eating pine bark stripped from deadfall and boiled until it was soft enough to chew. I caught one rabbit in a snare made from torn strips of my blanket. It fed me for 2 days. I lost 15 pounds I didn't have to lose. My ribs showed through my skin. My hands shook constantly, and not just from the cold. I would wake in the night with my heart racing, certain that if I fell back asleep, I would not wake again. The second time was in December. A storm came down from the peaks with no warning, clear sky at noon, white out by 2. I was 100 yards from the cabin gathering deadwood when the wind hit. I couldn't see the cabin. I couldn't see my own hands. I walked in what I thought was the right direction and walked for what felt like an hour. When I finally stumbled into a structure, it was the sealed cave, not the cabin. I spent that night inside the cave, huddled against the iron door, listening to the storm try to tear the world apart. The temperature outside dropped to 30 below zero. Inside the cave, wrapped in the canvas tarps that covered my grandfather's materials, I survived. The cave held at 50 degrees. My grandfather's measurements had been correct. The third time was in February. I had found the spring. It wasn't much, a trickle of water seeping from a crack in the rock near the back of the cave, collecting in a natural basin before draining away into the limestone. But it was water, clean and cold, and it meant I didn't have to melt snow anymore. I went to check it every morning. That morning, I slipped on ice at the cave entrance. I fell badly, caught my left arm against the iron doorframe, and felt something snap. The pain was so sudden and complete that I couldn't breathe. I lay on the frozen ground outside the cave, my arm bent at an angle arms shouldn't bend, and I thought, this is how I die. A broken arm will become infected. I can't set it myself. I can't hike 7 miles to town. I will die here, alone, and no one will find me until spring. I lay there for a long time. The cold crept into me. The sky was gray and empty. What stopped me from giving up, what made me drag myself back to the cabin, splint my arm with 2 sticks and strips of cloth, and keep breathing, was a single line from my grandfather's journal. The work waits to be finished. I had not finished the work. I had not even started. I had survived the winter by luck and stubbornness, but I had not touched the corrugated iron sheets stacked in the cave. I had not begun the structure my grandfather had designed. I had done nothing but not die. That was not enough. My arm healed crooked. It still aches when the weather changes. But by late March, the snow was melting, and I could move it well enough to work. I opened my grandfather's notebooks again and started planning. The first step was clearing space inside the cave. My grandfather had stacked his materials along the walls, but the center of the main chamber was cluttered with fallen rock and debris that had accumulated over the years. I worked with the small axe in my bare hands, moving stone by stone, for 3 weeks. The physical labor was brutal. I was still weak from the winter, still underweight, still healing. Every night I collapsed onto the dirt floor of the cabin and slept like the dead. But every morning I woke, ate whatever I could find or catch, and went back into the cave. Progress was measurable. The first week, I cleared a space 10 feet by 10 feet. The second week, I extended it to 10 by 20. By the end of the third week, I had a clear area roughly 20 feet by 30 feet in the center of the main chamber, enough space to begin construction. The corrugated iron sheets were heavy. Each one weighed perhaps 40 pounds. I could carry 2 at a time if I balanced them carefully, but I couldn't carry them and position them at the same time. I needed a frame to hold them in place. My grandfather's notebooks had the answer. He had designed a system of wooden supports, curved ribs that would hold the iron sheets in an arched shape, like the frame of a Quonset hut or an old covered wagon. The wood was already cut and stacked along the cave wall. All I had to do was assemble it. I set the first rib on a Tuesday in April. It took me 6 hours to get it positioned correctly. The base wedged between rocks on the cave floor, the curved top reaching up toward the stone ceiling. When I finally stepped back and saw it standing there, a single wooden arch in the middle of the empty chamber, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. The second rib went up the next day, the third the day after. By the end of April, I had 12 ribs standing in a row, spaced 3 feet apart, forming the skeleton of an arched structure roughly 36 feet long. Then I started hanging the iron. The corrugated sheets were designed to overlap, each one hooking onto the curve of the one below it. My grandfather had drilled holes in the ends and provided wire to tie them together. The work was slow. I had to climb a makeshift ladder of stacked stones, hold the sheet in place with one hand, and wire it down with the other. One wrong move and the whole thing could come crashing down on me. The first sheet took 4 hours. The second took 3. By the 10th, I had the rhythm of it, and I could hang 2 sheets in a day. But there was a problem. The gap between the top of my arched iron roof and the natural stone ceiling of the cave was too large, 8 feet in some places, 10 feet in others, and that gap needed to be filled with insulation, packed tight, no air spaces, or the heat would escape up into the empty space, and the whole design would fail. I needed hundreds of pounds of dry, organic material. Pine needles, dead moss, dried leaves, whatever I could find. And I needed it before winter came again. I was sitting outside the cave entrance, looking at the forest below and calculating how many trips it would take to gather enough material, when I heard footsteps on the scree. I grabbed my axe and stood. The only people who came up here were people who wanted something, and I had learned that winter that wanting usually meant taking. The man who came around the bend in the trail was old, 70 at least, maybe older. He walked with a pronounced limp, leaning on a gnarled pine staff. His face was weathered to the color of old leather, and his eyes were deep-set and dark. He wore a prospector's clothes, canvas pants, a flannel shirt, suspenders holding everything together. He stopped 10 feet from me and studied the cave entrance, the iron door, the stacks of materials visible in the darkness beyond. Then he looked at me. "Alan Caldwell's grandson," he said. It wasn't a question. I tightened my grip on the axe. "Who's asking?" "Name's Jeremiah Holt. People call me Jerry." He limped closer, using his staff to steady himself on the loose rock. "I knew your grandfather, back when we were both young enough to think we could make something of this country." My grandfather's been dead for 40 years. 38, I was at the burying. Jerry stopped beside me and looked into the cave again. His eyes moved over the wooden ribs, the hanging iron sheets, the cleared floor. He talked about this, you know. Near the end, said he was leaving it all ready for someone who'd understand. He didn't leave it for me. He didn't even know I existed. Maybe not. Jerry turned and looked at me, really looked, the way someone looks when they're measuring you against some private standard. But here you are anyway, and you're building what he designed. I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what there was to say. Jerry nodded, as if I'd answered some question he hadn't asked out loud. "Your grandfather was right, you know, about the physics, about what this place could be." He tapped his staff against the rock beneath our feet. "The problem is he wasn't a builder. He was a thinker. He could design it, but he couldn't make it. His hands weren't strong enough and his lungs gave out before he could find someone to help." "And you?" Jerry smiled, a small, crooked thing that barely moved his face. "I'm a builder. Spent 40 years in the mines before my legs gave out. I know rock, and I know how to make things that last." He looked at the cave again, at my unfinished work. "You've got the structure right, but you're going to need help with the insulation, and you're going to need to learn a few things about sealing joints and directing heat. Why would you help me?" Jerry was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer. "Because your grandfather asked me to. 38 years ago, on his deathbed, he made me promise to watch the claim, to help whoever was fool enough to try to finish it." He shrugged. "I've been watching. Most people who inherited it took one look and left. You're the first one who stayed." He turned and started limping back down the trail. "Wait," I called. He stopped but didn't turn around. "You said he was right, about what this place could be. What did he tell you?" Jerry was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "He told me that someday someone would live through a winter in that cave so comfortable they'd barely need a fire. He told me they would grow food in the darkness. He told me they would prove that a worthless piece of rock could save more lives than all the gold in Colorado. He started walking again. "I'll be back tomorrow," he called over his shoulder. "Bring some water. The climb's a killer on an old man's throat." I stood there watching him go until he disappeared around the bend in the trail. Then I looked back at the cave, at the skeleton of ribs and iron sheets, at the impossible gap that needed filling, and the impossible winter that was coming. But for the first time since I'd arrived, I didn't feel alone. Jerry came back the next morning, just as he'd promised. He brought a canvas sack of dried moss and a coil of wire I hadn't known I needed. We worked together for 6 hours, and in that time I learned more about construction than I had in 6 months of working alone. Jerry taught me things that weren't in my grandfather's notebooks. How to seal the joints between iron sheets with a mixture of pine pitch and ash so water couldn't seep through. How to angle the sheets so condensation would run toward the walls instead of dripping onto the floor. How to create a chimney channel through the insulation layer that would vent smoke without letting heat escape. His hands were gnarled with age and old injuries, but they knew exactly where to go. He would watch me struggle with a wire tie for 5 minutes, then reach over and twist it into place with 2 fingers. He never criticized. He just showed me the right way and waited for me to understand. "Your grandfather designed this on paper," Jerry told me one afternoon. We were sitting on a flat rock outside the cave, eating a thin soup I'd made from wild onion and the last of a squirrel I'd snared the week before. But he never built anything bigger than a birdhouse in his life. Beautiful plans, terrible hands. So why did he think he could build this? He didn't. Jerry set down his bowl and looked at the cave entrance. He thought someone else would, someone younger, someone with the time and the strength. He paused. He thought it might be me at first, but by the time he died, my lungs were already going bad from the mines. Couldn't handle the altitude anymore, had to move down to Ridge Creek. But you kept coming up here. Once a year at least, to check on the claim, to make sure nobody had torn the place apart for scrap. He smiled that small, crooked smile. To wait. For what? For you, or someone like you. He picked up his bowl again. Took longer than I expected, but here you are. We gathered insulation through the summer. Jerry knew where to find the best materials, which stands of pine had the thickest needle beds, which north-facing slopes held moss that stayed dry even after rain. We filled canvas sacks until they weighed 50 pounds, then dragged them up the trail to the cave. Every trip took 4 hours round trip. We made the trip twice a day, 6 days a week for 3 months. By August, we had accumulated over 2,000 pounds of dried organic material. It filled the back of the cave in great piles, waiting to be packed into the gap between my iron roof and the stone ceiling. The packing was the hardest part. We had to climb onto the iron structure, reach up into the gap, and stuff the material into every crevice by hand. The dust got into our lungs and eyes. The sharp pine needles cut our fingers. We worked in shifts, 2 hours on, 2 hours rest, because anything longer and we'd start making mistakes. Jerry's cough came back in September. I heard it first in the mornings, a wet rattle that he tried to hide by walking away from the cave entrance. But as the weeks passed, it got worse. Some days he couldn't climb onto the structure at all. He would sit on the cave floor and direct me, pointing to gaps I'd missed, telling me where to pack tighter. I didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. We both knew what it meant. By October, the insulation was complete. 8 feet of packed pine needles and dried moss filled the gap between my curved iron roof and the granite ceiling above. The structure was 36 feet long and 12 feet wide at the base, arching up to a peak of 8 feet. It looked like a metal cocoon nestled inside the cave's natural chamber. I built a small stove inside, just a box of stacked stones with a metal plate on top, vented through a clay pipe that ran up through the insulation and out a natural crack in the overhang. Jerry showed me how to angle the pipe so downdrafts couldn't push smoke back inside. The first night I lit a fire in that stove, the temperature inside the structure rose from 52 degrees to 68 in 3 hours. I burned perhaps 5 pounds of wood. The walls radiated warmth. The metal ceiling reflected it back down. I took off my jacket for the first time in months. 70 degrees, I said, reading the thermometer Jerry had brought, with almost no fire. Jerry was sitting against the far wall, wrapped in a blanket. His cough had been bad that day, but he smiled, a real smile, not the small crooked one, and said, "Your grandfather was right." I thought about the journals, about the line I'd read on my first day in this place. They called it worthless. I think it's only worthless if you never look beneath. He was right, I said. But he's not the one who proved it. We are. Word of what I'd built spread slowly at first. A hunter who got lost in an early snowstorm found his way to the cave and spent the night. He left before dawn, but 3 days later, 2 of his friends came up to see if the stories were true. They stood inside the structure for 10 minutes, feeling the warmth, looking at the stone ceiling above and the iron ceiling below, and they didn't say anything. They just nodded and left. Then Mrs. Gosler came. I was outside the cave splitting wood when I heard her coming up the trail. She wasn't alone. She had brought 2 other women from town, both of them wrapped in heavy shawls against the October chill. They stopped 20 feet away and stared at the cave entrance like it might bite them. "So it's true," Mrs. Gosler said. "You're living in the mountain." I set down my axe. "I'm living in a structure inside the mountain. There's a difference." "Is there?" She stepped closer, peering into the darkness of the cave. "The whole town thinks you've lost your mind, boy, just like your grandfather, building things no one understands, sealing yourself inside rock." She shook her head. "It isn't natural." "It's physics," I said. "The cave holds a steady temperature. The insulation traps heat. The metal reflects it back. There's nothing unnatural about it." "Physics." She made the word sound like a curse. "That's what your grandfather said, too, near the end. Physics and measurements and calculations." She crossed her arms. "And where is he now? Dead and buried on a worthless claim, and you're following right behind him." Something in me snapped. Maybe it was the months of work, the broken arm, the winters I'd barely survived. Maybe it was hearing my grandfather dismissed again by someone who had never looked beneath anything in her life. "My grandfather was right," I said. My voice was steady, but I could feel the heat behind it. "Every measurement he made was accurate. Every calculation was correct. He just didn't live long enough to prove it." I pointed at the cave. "I did." "Prove what? That you can sleep inside a rock? That you can come inside?" Mrs. Gosler stopped mid-sentence. The 2 women behind her exchanged glances. "Come inside," I repeated. "Spend 5 minutes in there, feel the temperature, then tell me my grandfather was crazy." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Mrs. Gosler lifted her chin, set her jaw, and marched toward the cave entrance. The other women hesitated, then followed. I led them through the outer chamber to the iron structure. The door was a simple frame of wood covered with canvas, but it sealed well enough. When I pulled it aside and they stepped through, I heard one of the women gasp. Inside the structure, the temperature was 65 degrees. The stone walls radiated the warmth the stove had put out that morning, even though the fire had burned down to coals hours ago. The air was still and warm, like a summer afternoon trapped in stone. Mrs. Gosler stood in the center of the structure, turning slowly, looking at the curved iron ceiling, the packed insulation visible through the gaps, the stone floor I'd swept clean. Her face was unreadable. "This is impossible," one of the other women whispered. "It's October. It should be freezing." 52 degrees, I said. "That's what the cave holds naturally. The insulation and the stove add the rest. With a small fire in the morning and another at night, I can keep it above 70 all winter." Mrs. Gosler hadn't said anything. She was staring at the wall where I had pinned several pages from my grandfather's notebooks, diagrams of the structure, temperature calculations, the thematic quote that had kept me going through the worst of it. They called it worthless. "I think it's only worthless if you never look beneath." Finally, she turned to face me. Her expression had changed. The contempt was gone. In its place was something more complicated, confusion maybe, or the beginning of respect. "Your grandfather," she said slowly. "He tried to explain this to people. Near the end, nobody listened." "I know. He came to my boarding house once, asked if I would come up here and see what he was working on. She paused. I told him I didn't have time for a crazy man's delusions. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Mrs. Gosler nodded once, as if confirming something to herself. I was wrong, she said. The words seemed to cost her something. About him. Maybe about you, too. She walked past me through the canvas door, back out into the cold October air. The other women followed. None of them looked back. But 3 days later, one of them returned. She brought her husband and a sack of flour she'd baked into bread. She asked if I would trade some of my firewood for it. She had seen the neat stacks outside the cave, and her own supply was running low. I gave her the wood. She gave me the bread. It was the first trade I'd made since arriving at the Beartooth claim. Winter came hard that year. The first snow fell in late October, earlier than anyone expected. By November, the drifts were 4 feet deep in the valley below. By December, they were 8 feet deep and still building. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero, then 30, then 40. The miners' families in Ridge Creek huddled around their stoves and burned through their wood supplies twice as fast as usual. The general store ran out of coal by Christmas. 2 elderly couples froze to death in their cabins before the new year. Inside my structure, wrapped in the stone embrace of the mountain, I kept the temperature at 70 degrees with 2 small fires a day. Jerry had moved into the cave with me when the first hard freeze came. His cabin in Ridge Creek wasn't insulated, and his cough had gotten worse. He slept in the warmest corner, wrapped in blankets, and watched me tend the stove. "This is what your grandfather imagined," he said one night. The wind was howling outside, driving snow against the overhang with a sound like sand against glass. A place where winter couldn't reach, where the cold was just a sound outside the walls. "He should have seen it," I said. "Maybe he does." Jerry's eyes were half closed. The warmth was making him drowsy. "Maybe he's watching right now from wherever the dead go. Seeing his numbers proved right, his work finished." I looked at the pages pinned to the wall, at my grandfather's precise handwriting. They called it worthless. "I hope so," I said. The first person to come asking for help was a woman named Clara Peterson. I knew the Petersons by reputation. They ran a small cattle operation in the valley, maybe 30 head, enough to keep a family fed and clothed, but not much more. Clara's husband, Martin, had been one of the men who laughed loudest in the general store when I'd asked for directions to the claim. He'd called me a fool to my face and worse behind my back. Clara arrived at the cave entrance on a morning in late January. The temperature outside was 35 below zero. She was wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned, and still shivering so hard she could barely speak. "Please," she said. Her lips were blue. "Our cabin, the fire went out. The children." I didn't ask questions. I pulled her inside, sat her by the stove, wrapped her in my spare blanket. Her teeth chattered for 20 minutes before she could talk properly. Her cabin's chimney had collapsed under the weight of ice and snow. The fire had gone out. Her husband was trying to dig out the chimney, but his hands had frozen, and he couldn't grip the shovel. Their 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, the oldest maybe 8, were huddled in the barn with the surviving cattle, trying to stay warm from the animals' body heat. "We didn't know where else to go," Clara whispered. "The town's 2 hours away. The drifts are too deep. And someone said, they said you had warmth here in the rock." I looked at Jerry. He was propped up against the wall, watching with eyes that missed nothing. "She's married to Martin Peterson," I said. "The one who called me." "I know what he called you," Jerry said quietly. "Do you care?" I thought about it. The memory of Martin's laughter, his contempt, his absolute certainty that I was throwing my life away on a pile of rocks, the way he'd turned his back when I walked past, like I wasn't worth the effort of a proper insult. Then I thought about 3 children huddled in a barn, slowly freezing to death while their father's hands turned black. "No," I said. "I don't care." I helped Clara back down the trail to her family's cabin. The drifts were chest high in places, and we had to dig through them with our hands. By the time we reached the Petersons' land, my fingers were numb and my lungs burned from the cold. Martin was in the barn, sitting on a hay bale with his hands tucked under his armpits. His face was gray with pain. Two of his fingers had already started to blacken. The children were pressed against a half-frozen cow, their eyes huge in their small faces. "What are you doing here?" Martin said when he saw me. Even now, with his family freezing around him, there was hostility in his voice. "Come to gloat?" "I came to help." I knelt beside the children. "We're going to walk to my place. It's warm there. You'll be safe." The oldest girl, Sarah, I learned later, looked at me with eyes that were too old for her face. "Papa said your place was cursed." "Your papa was wrong." The walk back took 2 hours. We had to stop every 15 minutes to rest, to re-warm hands and faces, to dig through new drifts that had formed since I'd passed. Martin couldn't walk by himself. His feet were frozen too, so Jerry and I took turns supporting him while Clara carried the youngest child. But we made it. I spent the next 3 days caring for the Peterson family. I fed them soup made from dried venison and wild onions. I wrapped Martin's hands in strips of cloth soaked in pine oil and prayed the blackness wouldn't spread. I taught Sarah how to tend the stove, how to keep the fire small and steady so the warmth would last. On the 4th day, Martin spoke to me for the first time. "Why?" he asked. His voice was hoarse. His hands were still bandaged, but the blackness had stopped spreading. He would lose 2 fingers, maybe 3, but he would live. "Why are you helping us?" "After everything I said about you, because I have warmth," I said. "And you needed it." "That's not an answer." I looked at him, at his weathered face, his bandaged hands, his eyes that still held suspicion even after everything. I thought about what Jerry had told me the night before, about what my grandfather had written in his journals about the nature of gifts and obligations. "The cave doesn't know who you are," I said finally. "The heat doesn't care what you called me, it just flows, from where there's more to where there's less." I stood up. "I could have turned you away. Some people would have called it justice. But the warmth doesn't know about justice either. It just is." Martin was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I was wrong about you." "I know. And about your grandfather." "I know that too." The Petersons left 3 days later when the weather broke enough for travel. Clara hugged me at the cave entrance. Sarah held my hand and said, "Thank you for not letting us die." Martin shook my hand carefully with his unbandaged palm and said, "If you ever need anything at all." "I'll remember," I said. Word spread. The Hendersons came next, an older couple whose root cellar had frozen solid, taking all their winter stores with it. Then the Mitchells, then the O'Briens, then families I'd never heard of who had heard of me. They came singly at first, then in groups, then in a steady stream that continued through February and March. I fed them what I could. I warmed them. I gave them blankets and soup and a place to sleep where the cold couldn't reach. I asked for nothing in return. Some of them brought what they had anyway, sack of flour here, a side of bacon there, a pair of wool socks knitted by someone's grandmother. These gifts accumulated in the corner of the structure more than I could use, more than I could have imagined owning a year before. Stanley Devlin came on the last day of February. Devlin was the closest thing the valley had to a rich man, a cattle baron with 500 head, and a house with glass windows and a wood stove in every room. He had never spoken to me directly, but I knew his reputation. He had tried to buy the Beartooth claim from my grandfather twice, offering good money for bad rock, as he put it. My grandfather had refused both times. When Devlin appeared at the cave entrance, I thought he had come to make me the same offer. I was wrong. His wife was with him, a small bird-like woman wrapped in a fur coat that probably cost more than everything I owned combined. She was carrying a bundle in her arms. The bundle was whimpering. "Our son," Devlin said. His voice was flat, empty of its usual bluster. "The cold. The doctor says his lungs." He stopped, swallowed. "The doctor says he needs warmth, real warmth, steady warmth, or he won't last the week." The bundle in Mrs. Devlin's arms moved. A small face appeared, pale, sweating despite the cold, eyes glassy with fever. A boy, maybe 3 years old, struggling to breathe. I stepped aside. "Come in." The boy's name was Thomas. He stayed in my cave for 9 days, wrapped in the warmest blankets I had, breathing air that was 70 degrees instead of 30 below. His mother never left his side. His father paced outside the cave entrance, too proud to come in more than once a day, too terrified to leave. On the 5th day, the fever broke. On the 7th day, Thomas sat up and asked for food. On the 9th day, he walked out of the cave under his own power, holding his mother's hand. Devlin stood at the entrance, watching his son approach. His face was a mask, but his hands were shaking. "How much?" he asked me. "For the boy's life." "How much do you want?" I thought about his offer to buy the claim, about the way rich men thought everything had a price, even survival. "Nothing," I said. "That's impossible. You must want—" "I want you to leave. I want you to take your son home and watch him grow up. I want you to remember that this rock you tried to buy for pennies saved his life." I looked him in the eye. "And I want you to remember that I gave it freely." Devlin's jaw worked. Something moved behind his eyes. Shame, maybe, or something harder to name. "I was wrong about this place," he said finally. "About your grandfather. About you." "Yes," I said. "You were." He left without another word. But 2 weeks later, a wagon arrived at the base of my trail loaded with lumber, nails, glass for windows, and a note that said only, "For the next structure." Spring came slowly that year. The snow melted in April, revealing a valley that had been ravaged by the worst winter in 50 years. Half the cattle herds were dead. A quarter of the cabins had collapsed under the snow load. 7 people had frozen to death, including the 2 elderly couples I'd heard about in December, but no one who had come to my cave had died. In May, a man arrived from Denver. He was a professor from the School of Mines, sent to investigate reports of an underground heating system that had survived impossible conditions. He spent 3 days measuring temperatures, examining the structure, reading my grandfather's journals. "This is remarkable," he said on the last day. He was standing inside the structure, holding a thermometer that read 62 degrees despite the spring chill outside. "The principles are sound. The execution is, well, better than I would have expected from a self-taught amateur." "My grandfather designed it," I said. "I just built it." "Your grandfather was a genius." The professor tucked his thermometer away. "I'd like to write a paper about this, present it to the Engineering Society. Would you allow me to credit him by name?" I looked at the wall, at the pages still pinned there, at the words that had kept me going through everything. "Yes," I said. "Credit him by name." The article appeared in a Denver newspaper 2 months later. It called my grandfather a visionary, and me the faithful heir who proved his theories correct. Mrs. Gosler cut out the article and pinned it to the wall of her boarding house. She told me about it herself, one afternoon in July, when she came up to deliver a basket of eggs from her chickens. "I suppose I owe you an apology," she said, setting the basket on my table, "for what I said when you first arrived." "You already apologized, inside the structure last winter." "That was different. That was just—" She waved her hand. "Surprise. Embarrassment at being wrong." She looked at me directly. "This is something else. This is me saying, your grandfather deserved better from this town. So did you. And I'm sorry I wasn't the one who gave it." I didn't know what to say. So I said what my grandfather had written in his journal near the end. "It's only worthless if you never look beneath." Mrs. Gosler nodded slowly. "I suppose that's true for people too." Jerry died in August. It happened quietly, the way he had lived. I woke one morning to find him still asleep in his corner, or what I thought was sleep. His eyes were closed, his face was peaceful. But when I touched his shoulder, his skin was cold. The cough had gotten worse through the spring, and we both knew what that meant. He had refused to see a doctor, refused to leave the cave except for short walks on warm days. I've lived 78 years, he told me once. That's more than most men get. I'm not going to spend my last months in a hospital bed, staring at walls. I buried him on the ridge above the cave, where he could look down at the work we had built together. I carved his name into a granite slab, Jeremiah Holt, 1842 to 1920, and planted a pine sapling beside it. The tree is 30 feet tall now. I can see it from the cave entrance every morning when I wake. 3 years after Jerry died, I married a woman named Abigail Clark. She was a teacher at the new school in Ridge Creek, 24 years old, with steady hands and a laugh that made me forget how quiet my life had become. We married in the spring, in a ceremony outside the cave entrance, with half the valley in attendance. We had 2 children, a boy named Alan, after my grandfather, and a girl named Clara, after the first woman who came to my door for help. They grew up in the cave structure, playing in the warm darkness while winter howled outside, learning to read by the light of candles and to love the mountain the way I loved it. Other people started building their own structures after that. Modified versions of my grandfather's design, adapted for different caves, different climates, different needs. By 1935, there were a dozen cave structures in the valley, and people came from as far as California to study them. A professor from Stanford wrote a book about the principles involved. He dedicated it to Alan Caldwell, who saw what others could not. I grew old in that cave. My hands, which had once been smooth and soft, became calloused and scarred, then weathered, then finally familiar with every inch of the stone I had spent my life inside. I learned to read the mountain the way Jerry had taught me, the subtle shifts in temperature that meant a storm was coming, the way the water flowed faster in spring, the quiet sounds the rock made when it contracted in the cold. Abigail died in 1941, peacefully, in the same corner where Jerry had slept. I buried her beside him, on the ridge, and planted another pine. My children were grown by then, with families of their own. They offered to take me in, to bring me down to the valley where life was easier. I refused. "This is where I belong," I told them. "This is where I'll stay." I died on a Tuesday in October of 1953. I was 84 years old. They found me kneeling in the small garden I had built beside the cave entrance, a terraced plot where I grew vegetables in the reflected warmth of the stone. My hands were still in the soil. I had been planting winter onions for the next season. My granddaughter, Sarah, named after the Peterson girl who had held my hand all those years ago, said that I looked peaceful. Like he was just resting, she told people at the funeral. Like he had finished what he set out to do and was ready to rest. They buried me on the ridge, beside Abigail and Jerry, beneath the pines we had planted. The cave structure still stands below us, warm and dry and solid, as it has stood for over a century now. People still use it, still marvel at the way it holds heat, still read the pages pinned to the wall where I left them. The first page is still there, at the center, where I put it on my first day in the cave. My grandfather's words, written 40 years before I was born, proven true by a 16-year-old orphan with nothing but stubbornness and time. They called it worthless. I think it's only worthless if you never look beneath. Judge Hayworth came to see me once, in the summer of 1921. He was old by then, 83 years old, retired from the bench, walking with 2 canes and a caretaker who followed him everywhere. He had a letter in his pocket. "I found this in my files," he said. We were sitting outside the cave entrance, watching the sun set over the valley. "From your grandfather, addressed to the Ridge Creek Orphans Fund, dated 1880. He handed me the letter. It was brittle with age. The paper yellowed, the ink faded to brown. But I could still read the words. "To whom it may concern, I am writing to establish a fund for the education and welfare of orphaned children in the Ridge Creek area. I have no children of my own, but I believe that every child deserves the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to prove themselves regardless of their circumstances. The enclosed sum of $200 represents the proceeds from the sale of my geological survey equipment. I ask that it be used to provide books, schooling, and practical training for any orphan who shows promise and determination. Signed, Alan Caldwell." I looked up at Judge Hayworth. His face was a mask, but his hands were trembling on his canes. "I never delivered it, he said. His voice was barely audible. I thought he was crazy. Everyone did. I assumed the money would be wasted, so I kept the letter. I kept the money. He paused. I spent the money 20 years ago on a new fence for my property. I didn't say anything. I didn't trust myself to speak. I'm sorry, Hayworth said. I was wrong about him. I was wrong about you. I spent my whole life thinking I knew who was worth helping and who wasn't, and I was wrong about all of it. I thought about the courtroom, the laughter, the line he had spoken that I had carried with me ever since. I suppose even the dead can play cruel jokes on the living. I forgive you, I said finally. The words surprised me as much as they surprised him. Not because you deserve it, but because holding on to it would only poison me. Hayworth nodded. He tried to say something else, but the words wouldn't come. He left a few minutes later, helped down the trail by his caretaker. I never saw him again. He died the following winter, and they buried him in the Ridge Creek Cemetery beneath a headstone that listed his years on the bench and said nothing about the letters he had never delivered. But I kept my grandfather's letter. I framed it and hung it beside his journal pages in the center of the cave wall, where everyone who entered could see it, a record of what he had tried to do, a reminder that worthiness isn't determined by those who judge us. So let me ask you something. I've told you about my grandfather's cave, about the worthless rock he bought for $5 and a bottle of whiskey, about the plans he drew and the materials he gathered, and the dream he didn't live to see completed. I've told you about my own journey, the laughter in the courtroom, the winters that nearly killed me, the moment I opened a trunk and found notebooks filled with faith in something no one else could see. But this story isn't really about caves. It's not about insulation or thermal mass or the engineering principles that make warmth possible in impossible places. It's about something simpler. It's about looking beneath. Everyone has a worthless claim. Everyone has a sealed cave they've been told not to enter. Maybe it's a skill someone laughed at. Maybe it's a dream someone called impossible. Maybe it's a part of yourself you've hidden because the world told you it wasn't valuable. What are you sitting on right now that everyone else has dismissed? What have you been afraid to dig into because you're not sure what you'll find? What did someone tell you about yourself, about your potential, your worth, your possibilities, that you believed without question? I was 16 years old when I inherited 30 acres of rock. I had 2 silver coins, a stolen blanket, and a judge's laughter ringing in my ears. Everyone who looked at that claim saw a joke, a burden, a cruel inheritance from a crazy old man. But I looked beneath, not because I was brave, not because I had some special vision. I looked beneath because I had nowhere else to look, because when you have nothing, you can't afford to dismiss anything as worthless. Every rock might be hiding water. Every sealed door might lead to warmth. The people who laughed at my grandfather weren't evil. They just never looked beneath the surface. They saw rock and assumed rock was all there was. They saw a sealed cave and assumed it was hiding nothing. Most people stop at the surface. Most people believe what they are told about what's valuable and what isn't. Most people spend their whole lives walking past sealed doors because someone once told them those doors led nowhere. But the surface is the least interesting part of any piece of land, and it's the least interesting part of any human being. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own sealed caves, your own rusted keys, your own worthless inheritances, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who built extraordinary lives out of nothing but stubbornness and time. Because somewhere in your life, there's a door you haven't opened. There's a claim you've been told is worthless. There's a voice inside you that sounds like my grandfather's handwriting, saying, "They called it worthless, but that's only true if you never look beneath." Your cave is waiting. Open the door.